Why, hello there. This is DM Nell. You may know me from such things as my Shadow of the Demon Lord video blog, of which this is yet another installment. In fact, I believe this is installment number 30. And as such, that makes it a milestone, I guess. And I would like to say more about that, but actually, I really don't care. I'm just doing this for fun. So today, what I'm going to talk to you about are three, maybe four related things. The first one, as you can see right here on my screen Z, is put me up there. There we go. Is the Heart of the Machine God. I'm covering up the name. There we are. Heart of the Machine God. This is something that came out a few months ago. I forget the exact date, but it is a legacy of Shadow for Shadow of the Demon Lord, and it talks about the Machine God. Now, the Machine God was something that was kind of touched upon very briefly. In fact, it was touched upon in a sidebar for another product that came out actually, I think, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And that product is this one, which is False Lives. And False Lives talks about different types of constructs. And it goes into the differences between constructs and clockworks and golems. I think golems are the very back. Yeah, here we go. So there are basically three different types of constructed beings. And so it goes into a lot of detail here, but it also talks about, right here in this little sidebar, worshiping the Cog God. Now, that's a very dangerous thing right there, the Cog God. And I have to think that Robert Schwab did that on purpose, because I've caught myself not saying Cog and saying something that sounds very similar, but is also very much not Cog. And I'm sure Mr. Schwab is chuckling to himself in his demonic laboratory. But at any rate, the Cog God was introduced here in the supplement. And like I said, this was a few years ago, and it talks about how clockworks have begun to believe that there is a god that they can worship called the Cog God. So that whole concept is introduced here. So this is one of the three things that I wanted to mention. This is actually a very good supplement in that it adds quite a few creatures to your monstrous compendium, or your bestiary, or whatever you want to call your collection of monsters for Shadow of the Demon Lord. But this is a good addition. It has lots of constructs, which really comes in handy when you're trying to populate a dungeon that's been abandoned for many years. It doesn't require some sort of ecology for living creatures to explain living creatures living there. If you just want an ancient abandoned dungeon or tower or whatever, you can stick constructs in there, because constructs don't have to, they don't eat, they don't breathe, they don't need to be, they don't need to have a food chain. They just exist pretty much indefinitely until something destroys them. So they're great for populating, dungeons like that you don't necessarily want to have to explain why a living creature is in it, or how a living creature could be in it. So anyway, it goes into a lot of detail for the various ones. So I definitely recommend that you check this out. I've used this quite a few times in my adventures, and like I said, it's come in very handy. One thing I want to point out that a lot of people don't realize, and this is actually something that was explained in the core rule book. Golems were in the core rule book, but I really kind of skipped over them because I was used to D&D golems, the iron golem, stone golem, and that sort of thing. This type of golem is a little bit more true to the original um, concept of golem from, I believe it's from Jewish faith. But one thing that I wanted to point out that I never picked it up in the core rule book, and this makes golems one of the coolest monsters that you can use as a true threat for your adventuring party, and that is under their stat block here. If you'll look under their immunities, you can see that they are immune from damage from cold. Okay, well, that makes sense. Disease and poison. Great, great, great. Gaining insanity. All right. They're immune to all afflictions. Okay, that's interesting. But here's the cool thing. They are immune to banes. That's right. They're immune to banes. They will never have a bane inflicted upon them ever. So as a difficulty 500 creature, you're talking about master tier opponents going up against the golem. And as you know, once you get the master tier, your players are going to be throwing all sorts of banes on top of your bad guys, trying to nerf them as much as possible. And that can be frustrating as a GM when you're trying to throw a significant challenge at your party, but they whittle them down with all these banes and afflictions. Well, dude, right here, this creature is immune to all afflictions and to banes. So if you really want to throw something unexpected at your players, throw a golem at them and watch them shit their pants. This is a cool monster. Anyway, I've also used legions, which is pretty cool. Legion is just a tiny constructs in a swarm. So this is something I used in a game not too long ago, actually about a year or so ago. Anyway, pretty cool monster construct again. So anyway, I didn't want to focus too much time on this supplement, but I did want to point it out. Cool supplement. So let me move on from this one. Back to the Heart of the Machine God. So, Heart of the Machine God is a supplement that talks about the Machine God or the Cog God. Now, they don't call it the Cog God in this supplement, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. But basically, it talks about this incarnation of the machine god that roams the land, and that essentially wherever it goes, a wave of madness follows it and causes people, living people and clockworks, to go insane, basically. And so it talks about the lore. It talks about the crawling caravan, which is the way that the machine god moves around, and it also talks about the confrontation with the machine god and what that might look like. Now, I'm not going to go into this in a whole lot of detail, simply because it's really just giving you ideas on how you can incorporate the machine god into your campaign. And I'm going to talk about how I would do it a little later in the video, after I cover the next supplement that I want to cover. But this goes into a lot of detail on the crawling caravan. It's basically a huge machine that is crawling across the landscape, and like I said, wherever it goes, it just has an aura of madness that causes entire villages to mutilate themselves and to go insane, all in the name of the machine god. And it actually has the aspect or the avatar of the machine god statted out here for when your players find the wagon and confront the avatar of the machine god. So this is clearly meant to be an evil presence in the world. It causes insanity and encourages humanoids and clockworks to mutilate themselves, all in the name of finding your perfect form. The whole premise of the machine god, or the whole thing that the machine god is trying to get across, is that you're born imperfect, and you have to mutilate yourself in order to find your own personal perfection. Which is kind of fucked up, but that's what the machine god is. It's a warped entity that is, basically, in my opinion and in my campaign, it is an entity that is actually trying to, and this is not part of the supplement, this is my take on it. It's an entity that's trying to exact revenge and in a very, very sadistic way against all of the humanoids that have used clockworks and abused clockworks and subjugated clockworks for the centuries that clockworks have been in a thing. So my take on it is the machine god is the revenge of the clockworks and constructs in general as well, but clockwork specifically against humanoids that have enslaved them for centuries. So that is the Heart of the Machine God. The next supplement is related, and it is the Cult of the Cog God. Now, this just came out a couple days ago, on Monday, I believe, of this week, and this week is the week of July the 13th, 2020, year of the COVID. And so this supplement, which has cool art, came out this week and is complementary to the Heart of the Machine God. But this is actually more from a player perspective. And so it goes more into the origins of the Cog God's faith, and it goes into some explanation of why people would worship the Cog God, and also gives you some information about how you can create a character or a priest that worships the Cog God. So we'll get that in a second. But basically, the faith started not very long ago. In fact, it talks about in the supplement here, it's about a decade old. And when it came into being, the Church of the New God, or the Cult of the New God, learned about it fairly quickly. And it began to believe that it was a fairly major threat. Even though new religions come and go in this campaign world all the time. In fact, there's a whole city that's just dedicated to a variety of religions that are, mostly unknown. But for whatever reason, it doesn't tell you why in the supplement. So that's something that you can kind of expand upon if you want to. But the Church of the Cult of the New God was very threatened by the cult, or the growing cult, or the growing religion of the Cog God. So they started essentially trying to wipe it out. First of all, they passed an edict saying that it's essentially illegal to worship the Cog God, as it is a false god and should not be worshipped. So that's the first thing they did. The second thing, they issued a decree banning the worship of the so-called Cog God. Second thing they did was to send out the Swords of Astrid, which is a sect of the Cult of the New God that is the military arm of the church. And they basically sent them out into the world to hunt down the acolytes of this new religion, the priests of this new religion. They also sent out, of course, the witch hunters and the inquisitors. And for a few years, that had Clockworks running scared because these fanatics were not very discriminatory. They pretty much went after all Clockworks, regardless of whether they were priests of the Cog God, whether they worshiped the Cog God or not. They really didn't discriminate. They pretty much went after all Clockworks, and that kind of goes along with the church's view on Clockworks. The cult of the new God believes that Clockworks are an abomination because in order to create a clockwork, you have to steal a living soul and implant it into the mechanical body. And that is disrupting the circle of life. And so the church or the cult, definitely frowns upon that. So clockworks just aren't liked by the cult of the new God. And when this religion began, they gave it an excuse basically to hunt down clockworks. Well, something happened a few years later, and that something was the rise or the uprising of the orcs and the slaying of the emperor and the taking of the alabaster throne by the new orc emperor Drudge. And the church or the cult of the new God was immediately threatened by that uprising. So they had to really kind of put aside their other projects, including this one, where they were hunting clockworks and trying to squash this new religion before it took off, in order to focus all their efforts on protecting themselves against the new emperor and his huge army of orcs. So what the church did, they started backpedaling a little bit, and they started to listen to some of the sympathizers of Clockworks, mostly in the city of Lidge, the city of wonders, which is where Clockworks got their start. Clockworks were discovered and created first in the city of wonder, and that's where you have the greatest population of Clockworks on the continent. Now, being as how the Clockworks have been around for so long in Lidge, you had people that sympathized with them that wanted Clockworks to be treated equally. And of course, Clockworks have been subjugated in Lidge as well because they started in Lidge as slave labor. They were created to be, machines, robots, essentially, as slave labor. But over time, that people realized that there were living souls in these machines, and so they felt that they should be treated equally. And so the church, being as how it had really pissed off a lot of people by hunting down Clockworks, and now was being threatened by the emperor and his army of orcs, realized essentially that they just created a new enemy and was not able to follow through on their original plans on squashing this religion. So now, not only did they have the emperor over here wanting to wipe out the cult of the new God, but now you have all these Clockworks that are pissed off at the church. So they decided to backpedal a little bit and say, okay, you know what, sympathizers, we agree with you. They are living souls in the Clockworks, so we believe they should also be treated equally. They should also be treated as as living beings. And so, that was their ploy. That was their politically their political angle for trying to take the heat off of the church from potential allies against the emperor and his orc army. So anyway, that is all described in the supplement, and then it goes on to talk about the how the religion actually began, and it kind of started about 10 years ago. See, Clockworks, they don't have a sense of origin. Most people have a homeland. Most people have, at least an ancestry that it can be traced back to a place or a group, and so they have an identity. But clockworks don't have an identity. They were created, they're all created in the image that their creator made them in. So they don't have similar appearances. They were created for different purposes, and so they lack that sense of community. They lack that sense of their place in the world, and so as such, they, with this newfound support by the church of the cult of the new god, and no longer being hunted by the inquisitors and the witch hunters and the swords of Astrid, they found this new freedom in the world, but they had they didn't know their place in it, and so this kind of contributed to the formulation of a concept that clockworks were not created on accident. In fact, they were actually created for a purpose, and the purpose is to improve upon the people that are already on the planet. Now, the people that are on the planet are humanoids. They're organic. They are made of flesh and bone. That is subject to disease. They have to have food. They can die of starvation or thirst. They definitely die of old age. And so the thought was that there must be a purpose for clockworks, and that purpose is to eventually replace the fragile humanoids that are populating the planet. Now, by replace, they don't mean, or they initially didn't mean, or they didn't believe that they meant, wipe out humanity and take over the world. It's more like an evolution, that eventually humanoids will die out because of their frail nature, and what will be left behind are the clockworks, who will inherit the world. And so the clockworks that began to popularize this concept basically started growing the idea that this was the plan of their true creator, the being that inspired the mortal to create the first clockwork. And so they started calling that entity the Cog God, or the machine god. And that's how essentially the religion grew, as a way to explain and to build a purpose for the clockworks of the world and what their place is in it. And so that is explained in great detail in this section here. But then it goes on to talking about the machine god. Now, the Cog God and the machine god are essentially, as it says here, two aspects of the same god. The same entity are both the Cog God and the machine god. However, they are opposites. They are yin and yang. So you've got the Cog God, who, again, tries to uplift clockworks and instill them with the belief that they're going to inherit the world. And then you have the machine god, this vengeful, hateful entity that wants to take out its anger and vengeance on its oppressors. And so both of these beings are essentially two aspects of the same god. Clearly, if you have a clockwork that is is aspiring to be a good being, aspiring to try to work with humanity or with humanoids to coexist, that person or that creature would be that clockwork would follow the Cog God. Because that's the Cog God's beliefs. And then you've got the priests or the angry clockworks that are hateful and resentful of humanoids, they would follow the machine god. So there are two different opposing beliefs that exist in the same god, which is pretty cool. Now the Cog Gods, the Cog God is not. It doesn't have an avatar. It's at least it doesn't. It's not explained or it's not defined in this supplement. That's something you can do if you want to, as an opposition to the machine gods crawling caravan. But you can also just leave it as a this ethereal being that the good and neutral and good clockworks of the world worship. Okay, so the rest of this basically talks about the priests of the Cog Gods and how you can create a character. One cool thing about it, though, is that there are also humans and humanoids that worship the Cog God, believing that it is an evolution to go from this frail mortal shell to a sturdy, permanent constructed shell. And so some of these people, maybe they lost families to plagues or whatever, actually want to transition into a clockwork in this lifetime. They want their soul taken from their mortal body and placed into a clockwork body. And it kind of talks about how you can do that. It's called a remade character, and there is a process described here that tells you how that can be done. So you can actually have, a character in your campaign that is talked into, the great life of the clockwork and wants to undergo that transition. You can definitely use a supplement to do that. All right, so those are the two supplements that define the machine god / cog god. And the other supplement that I showed you several variant creatures, constructs, and clockworks and golems. So those are three of the things that I wanted to cover today. The last thing is, before I go into how I would use these in a campaign, the last thing is the actual supplement for the City of Wonders. And that goes into a little bit more detail on clockworks and their place in the city. It doesn't touch on it in a whole lot of detail, but it gives you some more ideas on how you can kind of use clockworks as the basis of a campaign, or at least as you're passing through the city, how clockworks are viewed there. So how I would use these supplements in a campaign, and I have actually already used them in some of my campaigns, but there are a couple ways you can go here. You can kind of just use bits and pieces of these supplements in an existing campaign just to kind of play on the construct / clockwork aspects of the game world. And especially if you've got a clockwork in your party, you can use some of this information to kind of flesh out their backstory and to give them a purpose for adventuring. So that's one way you can do it. Another way would be to actually build a campaign around the idea of this rising religion and what impact that would have on the world, and the conflicts between the Cog God worshippers and the machine god worshippers. So I kind of foreshadowed this in my last Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign, which wasn't focused on clockworks, but I integrated kind of bits and pieces of this lore into that campaign to foreshadow a future campaign. And the future campaign would be the Rise of the Machine, inspired by all robot apocalypse, media and pop culture out there. So, and who doesn't want a robot apocalypse in their fantasy campaign? I mean, come on. So the foreshadowing that I used was that my campaign was exploring the Confederacy of the Nine Cities, and it was actually my group started off in Caicres at the time of the uprising of the Orcs, and they had to escape Caicres, and they escaped towards the Confederacy of the Nine Cities. So naturally, they had to visit several of the cities. Now, they didn't go to all nine, but one of the cities that they did go to was the City of Wonders. And so when they visited the City of Wonders, I explained how clockworks are still somewhat subjugated in Lidge. Now, there's actually currently a bit of a civil rights movement going on in Lidge for giving clockworks equal rights. And there were, I showed, I talked about in my campaign, I talked about how there were, there were gatherings, and there were protests, and there were, things that showed that the people were ready to give clockworks a place among society, other than as slaves. So, you still have slavery essentially being legal in Lidge for the machines, and this movement is trying to overthrow that. And of course, you know how that went with our own history. There was definitely opposition, and people didn't want to give up don't want to give up their their slave labor. So, but that was just the backdrop, and it wasn't the main storyline. But it was, again, there to foreshadow this tension that is growing in the empire. So that's how I kind of used it as a foreshadow for a future campaign. Now, I don't know what that future campaign looks like. What I could see it going a couple different ways, but I think that mostly what I like is the idea that these two opposing viewpoints of the Cog God and the Machine God would ultimately come to clash somewhere, somehow, and probably have to do with the emancipation of the clockworks throughout the entire civilized world. So how to build up to that and how to culminate that in a campaign, I still haven't wrapped my head around that, because I have like 5 other campaigns that I want to do before I get to that. So, but it's still a cool idea, and I want to do it because, again, I like the idea of a robot uprising, and I want part of that campaign to be that the clockworks, like the orc uprising, the clockworks are starting to uprise. So normal people, humans, dwarves, halflings, they're freaking out because you've got all of these uprisings going on, and all of these apocalyptic events happening every few years, and people are starting to really freak out, and this is starting to unsettle the world and unsettle civilization, causing it to break apart, which is ultimately what's going to happen in my mega campaign, which I talked about in another video. I'm actually kind of plotting out this mega campaign, which chronicles the downfall of the world. Each campaign highlights one of the shadows of the demon lord, and eventually it will get to the point where the world is so messed up that it's barely barely anything living on it. It's truly a wasteland, a post-apocalyptic wasteland. That's like the very end of the campaign, where the shadow of the demon lord finally breaks the wall down, their barrier between the void and earth, and the final confrontation against the survivors and the demon lord comes to pass. Anyway, that's my grand vision of my mega campaign. This Robot Uprising would just be a chapter in that, so it would be a self-contained, first through 10th level campaign, chronicling that aspect of the downfall of the world. But as I stated, I really haven't put a whole lot of thought into it yet. But this supplement, since it just came out, just kind of got me thinking about it again. And I really wanted to talk about it in a video while it was fresh in my mind. And so that's why I did it. So at any rate, that's really about all I had to talk about on this video. And I am actually working on some stuff that I can't really talk about just quite yet. Those of you that follow my my Roll20 videos know that I create tokens for Roll20 to be used in your games, and the tokens that I use, a lot of them are geared towards use for Shadow of the Demon Lord specifically. And so, as you know, I put out 5 sets, or you may not know, I put out 5 sets so far. They're called Bloody Tokens. And I've got 5 of them out there. The last one I put out like in March-ish, something like that. And I haven't been working on any more since then. Instead, I'm working on something else, kind of related, also for Roll20, perhaps even for Drive-Thru RPG. If I want to go that route, I haven't decided yet, but I definitely want to put it out on Roll20 because there are far too few Shadow of the Demon Lord options for Roll20. The official ones are out there that it has begun releasing. They have some starter adventures, and then they also have some novice adventures out on the Roll20 marketplace. But there are no third-party adventures for Shadow of the Demon. Well, I take that back. There is one third-party adventure that is for Shadow of the Demon Lord, but it's actually for a campaign called Mists of Akuma. And I'm not familiar with that campaign, so I haven't bought it, and I don't know anything about it. But that's the only third-party supplement that I know that uses the Shadow of the Demon Lord game system. So I'm trying to get something created as a third-party publisher for Roll20, and I hope to be able to get that wrapped up here in the next few weeks. And maybe I'll make a video about that once I'm able to get that wrapped up, put out on the marketplace, and have it, out there in the universe for you all to consume if you wish. So anyway, that's a little teaser. I don't really have anything else. Oh, I do have one last thing. Gen Con for 2020 has been canceled, but there is a Gen Con online that has been established, and I am actually going to be running a game. The game that I'm running is one of my favorite adventures that have been published for Shadow of the Demon Lord, and it is the Demon's Wet Nurse. I kind of do my own take on it. It's mostly, I keep mostly to the story as written, but I have made some modifications just to make it my own. But I think most people would recognize it if they played through it with me DMing. I think you would recognize the core storyline. But I have made some alterations that make it even more screwed up than it already is. And it's a pretty screwed up module or adventure. So that's what I'm running that on Friday the 31st at 1 p.m. Eastern time. I'm doing it on Roll20. And the voice will be over Discord. Voice and video will be over Discord. So if you're interested, I've got room at my virtual table for up to 6 players. I will only run the game if I have a minimum of 4 players. So if you're interested, maybe you haven't gotten your fill of Shadow of the Demon Lord because you don't have anybody to run it for you, well, here's your opportunity to jump in on a one-shot game. So anyway, just wanted to throw that out there as well. All right. I think that wraps it up for today. Thanks again for being a part of this video series. And I will come back at you when I have something useful to talk about. So with that, hail to all you fellow cultists out there, and catch y'all later. Bye.